Okay. Bruchim habayim. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight for the learning of Hilchot Shabbat. Very important study where we go through the Melachot of Shabbat and all the different halachot of Shabbat. Tonight we are sponsored anonymously. Leilui Nishmat Tikva Bat Ezra. Zichron Libracha, Meher Neshama Go Hayon Hayon Gan Eden. We'd also like to dedicate tonight's learning for the Refuah Shlema of Mordechai Meredad ben Evelyn, of Shachar ben Chana, of Shmuel Moshe ben Penina, and of Rabbi Baruch ben Tzivi, and Kol Cholei Yisrael, whoever needs a Refuah Shlema, Hashem should send it to them very quickly, very speedily. Amen. Okay, so tonight we move on to the Melacha that we've all been waiting for. This one might take us some time. This is Melechet Bishul, the laws of cooking on Shabbat. They are numerous, they are extensive. There is a whole lot to talk about. But, I'm sorry, this is Melacha number 11. And we took a little break from Melachot. I think it was 2 weeks ago. We spoke about some halachot about what we can and cannot instruct goyim to do for us on Shabbat, and what benefit we may have from their labor that they do, if they do something for us or not for us. So there's a lot to talk about over there too. But tonight, Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to be focusing on the groundwork, the very basic details about the laws of Bishul, of cooking on Shabbat. What is considered to be cooking, what is not considered to be cooking, and the various rules that play out because of these these fundamental basic rules that we're going to learn about. I'm sorry? I came out with number 11. Yeah. I could count them if you would like. Let's do it. Here we go. Just, I think it's number, okay. Zorea, Choresh, Chotzer, Me'amer, Dash, Zoreh, Borer, Tochen, Meraked, Lash. Now, Meraked, probably the reason that you have it as 10 is because we didn't really do Meraked. Meraked is basically the same thing as Borer. So we included that in Borer. So yes, on the number that we have, it would be number 10. So yes, that's why you have 10. But really, Meraked just means using a sifter. It's another form of borer. Yeah.
Are you allowed to? Is a child allowed to play with clay?
Okay,
the same thing like Play-Doh?
Let's try and stay focused on Bishul. Okay. So we can start the groundwork for that, and then Blina there afterwards. Maybe we'll have some time. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So now, in the construction of the Mishkan, as we've been talking about, the creation of the dyes was very, very important, and that's what they used to color all the different curtains of the Mishkan. And these dyes were created by taking them, of course, sorting out all the junk that was necessary, grinding it, mixing it with water, making it into a thick paste, then finally cooking it in a pot. Once it was cooked in a pot, now you have this beautiful liquid that you can then mix together with all the wool and all the different things and make them into these beautiful colored curtains. So therefore, when the act of cooking was done, that involved a fire, that involved taking something and making it into a cooked item by heating it up to the point where it reached what we call Yad Soledet Bo, which we translate generally either 111 degrees Fahrenheit or 113 degrees Fahrenheit, different opinions, but somewhere around there. And once it reaches that temperature, it is considered to be cooked. When we're talking about a liquid, that's how it works. By simply heating up that liquid to the point where it reaches the temperature known as Yad Soledet Bo. Very important to know that terminology. Yad Soledet Bo means that the hand recoils when it comes in contact with it because it's hot. So that is a dispute amongst the authorities. It's 111, 113 Fahrenheit, but it's around there basically. Once you heat up a liquid to that point, you have cooked it. And therefore, it is the violation of the Melacha of Bishul, of cooking on Shabbat. In the actual list of Melachot, it's called Ofeh. Ofeh means baking. The reason it's called Ofeh is because the Gemara says it's in the list of things, it's usually the end result of grinding flour and kneading it is that you then have a dough which you bake. But like we're explaining, at least according to Rashi, in the construction of the Mishkan, it had nothing to do with baking, it had to do with cooking these curtains, cooking these pastes and making them into a liquid so that you could use them as dyes for the curtains. Okay, clear so far, so good? Amazing. So now, so it's important to be aware that when it comes to a liquid, that's really the act of cooking. Simply giving it that heat and turning it into a liquid that is hot, that is the act of cooking. Now, I want to just point out, somebody once asked my wife if you could heat up, it was some kind of fragrance or some kind of smell. You take this nice smelling, maybe it was some kind of spices, you put it in water. When you heat it up, it comes out in the steam and it gives a nice smell to the house. Can you do that on Shabbat? And the reason for her question was because, look, it's not food. I'm not cooking this to eat it. I'm just making a nice smell. I'm having the liquid come out of the pot so that it should steam up and it should make a nice smell in the house. To which the answer is that assumption is wrong. Cooking is not a melacha that necessarily involves food. It could involve food, but it's not limited to food. Whenever you take a liquid and you heat it up and you cause it to reach that point where it's steaming, that's definitely the act of Bishul. Like we said, in the construction of the Mishkan, it had nothing to do with food, right? But it applies to food too. So that's a very important thing to be aware of. Cooking is not limited to food at all. It could be any type of, many things could be involved in cooking. If you heat up a metal to the point where it becomes malleable, right? Or you harden something malleable so that it's very, very strong and you can't move it anymore. The poskim talk about that being called cooking too. So these are, cooking applies everywhere. So I'm just mentioning this because this is the foundation of cooking. Now, there are different methods of cooking, but before we get there, we mentioned cooking for a liquid. What does cooking mean for a solid? The answer is, it means whenever you take something that is raw, you take something and you make it edible, that is a significant change for that solid, and therefore that would be considered cooking. At what point is it called edible? So there are different opinions. There's an interesting discussion in the Gemara about a fellow by the name of Ben Derusai, the son of Derusai. He was a bandit. He was always on the run. He was on the other side of the law, and he didn't have time to cook his food. So he'd have to eat his food very, very quickly. He cooked it to the minimum amount that he needed to cook it, that was just edible, and then he would eat it and run. So the poskim say that this fellow, there's a difference in opinion if it was at least half cooked or a third cooked. But either way you look at it, the point is that at a third cooked or a half cooked, this is considered to have been cooked. You are somebody who just cooked the item. If, let's say, you only heated it up to a quarter of the cooking, I shouldn't say heated. If you only cooked it a quarter of the way, that would not be called cooking. But if you cooked it a third of the way already, at that point, some poskim say that this is considered to have been an act of cooking because that's the minimum amount of cooking required to make it edible. So for a solid, when you cook it at least a third of the way, or some say that's not enough, some say you did half of the way, at that point already, it's considered to have been cooked. Okay. And like I said, when it comes to non-foods, it could even be other things like taking it, making it very solid, or making it malleable, right? That would have an effect on it. That's called cooking that item. Okay. Now, There are different methods that cooking could take place with on Shabbat. The first is called ur. Ur means fire. So by cooking it through the fire, that is something that is going to be considered cooking on Shabbat. Taking it, heating it up on a flame, without question, is an act of cooking. Okay, that goes without saying. That's fire. Okay. The chidush now that we're going to talk about is called toledet tahur. Toledet tahur means when you have the derivative of the fire. Derivative of the fire means that something was heated up by the fire. Take, for example, a pot. You had a nice boiling pot of soup. You take the boiling pot of soup off of the fire, and now there is no fire around. You just have a very hot pot of soup. And now you take an egg and you throw it into the pot of boiling hot soup, and you cook the egg. So that is considered what we call toledet ha'ur, or toladot ha'ur, the derivative of the fire. And that is just as much cooking as the fire itself. No difference between the two. It's both considered to be an act of cooking mideoraita, on a Torah level, biblical level. Okay, very important to be aware of that. Now, okay. The next type of cooking is, and by the way, we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go along. There's a lot of stories, a lot of situations with toledet ta'ur that we really need to be aware of.
But I feel like hot soup is not gonna cook an egg.
Like Asians do that. I know there's
Yeah, for sure.
some Asian culture, they do that. They literally put egg in like hot soup and it cooks.
Yeah,
It's a
like putting egg in
cuisine.
solids. Like hot, like
they
egg
at the
drop
table, they do
soup.
it.
So you have to understand something. Halachically, when a vessel was on the fire, we're going to talk more about this at great length. That vessel is called a kli rishon, which means it's the first vessel to have been directly on the fire. It was directly heated up by the fire. That vessel, as long as the contents inside are, or even the walls itself of that vessel, as long as they are yad soledet bo, which means that they're at that temperature of 113 degrees Fahrenheit, they cook. Pi halacha, they have the ability to cook.
Some people take
Okay.
hot water and they like put it on the blech and they take it.
One second, just let's absorb the facts first of all. Clear?
Yeah.
Okay, so as long as it is at that heat and it's a clear shun off the fire, it's considered to be something that cooks. Okay, so it's important to be aware of that. Now, third type of cooking.
The toladot was number 2.
Correct.
Oh, I thought it was off.
Ur is the fire itself. Toledet ur means something that was a derivative of the fire, meaning this is not on the fire anymore. But even if, let's say, I take something and I place it against the outside of the pot and it gets heated up, it gets cooked by me putting it right next to the pot. That's called toledet ur. That's called cooking with something that was heated up by the fire. There's no fire anymore, but this object was heated up by the fire. That is just as much considered to be cooking, just like if it was on the fire itself.
But that would have to be yad soledet.
Yes, correct. Yad soledet, right.
So
If it cooled down and it's no longer that temperature, then it's not going to cook anymore.
what if it actually, in fact, does cook? What if it's not yad soledet both?
If it's not yad soledet, but does not halachically cook anymore.
Okay, but what if in fact it cooks it, but halachically it's not?
If halachically it doesn't cook it, you don't have to worry about it.
But if in fact it cooks it,
Don't worry about it.
yeah?
Halachically doesn't cook it, don't worry about it. We care about
You get what I'm
halachot.
saying, right? Like,
We care about halachot. If the halacha says it's not considered cooked, that's all we care about. It's a good point going forward.
do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, and let's ease our concerns.
Okay.
If the halacha says that it's not called cooking, then don't consider it cooking. Okay? It's very important moving forward to have that principle clear. Okay?
Because I'm saying to myself, if I put the egg in it.
Again, because you're confusing what you think is cooking and what halacha thinks is cooking. For our purposes now, we care about what halacha views as cooking. That's all we care about. Okay, the minute that we start mixing in our own thoughts and feelings into this, it's gonna start getting messy.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
is
the
it?
fact pattern, so and so took the soup off the fire, and it was not yet, so let it go. They threw an egg in there and the egg cooked. Was this cooking or not cooking? They'll say it was not cooking.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay? Very important. If it was not, meaning you literally had the temperature down clear, the stuff inside of that pot was less than 113 degrees Fahrenheit, the halacha says that's not called cooking. Maybe it's 111, different opinions, whatever. The point is, at that point, it's not called cooking. Clear? Yeah.
What if you put in something that's already halfway cooked?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's a very good question. Can it be considered completing the cooking? Very good question.
Like
So-
onion soup, let's say you put cheese and bread in the.
Good
soup,
questions. Lots of good
That
questions.
melts the. s-
Can you write that question down? We'll get back to it. And don't let me leave the room without answering that question.
But I
Appreciate
wouldn't
it.
put
Okay.
Cheese in onion soup for Shabbat.
Yes, probably not. Probably not. Okay. The next type of cooking that we're going to talk about is called chama. Chama means sunlight. Sunlight is not limited to sunlight. Sunlight means anything that is not fire or derivative of the fire. Okay? It's important to be aware of that. Like if you could come up with some chemical reaction that's going to produce heat,
Solar.
right? No, I'm talking about, let's say you have a chemical reaction, a pouch full of chemicals that you could cause them to react with one another and thereby produce heat, right? That is not, let's say, making a fire. That's a chemical reaction that's producing heat. And therefore, that's not considered to be making a fire on Shabbat. It would be considered to be chama. Chama means sunlight, right? But sunlight, like I'm saying, is not limited to sunlight. It's anything that's not fire or derivative of the fire we call chama. Now, let's just keep it simple, talking about sunlight. If I, for example, decide I want to cook something in the sun, so the halakha says that's perfectly acceptable to do on Shabbat. So if let's say it's a very hot day outside, and I take an egg, I go over to my frying pan, and maybe I spray some Pam on it, I crack an egg on it, the frying pan is cold, the egg is cold, everything is cold. And I simply take it to the rooftop, and I want to cook it there on the rooftop. And guess what? I come back after a few minutes and it's cooked. Enjoy the egg. Mutar lechatchila, no problem. If let's say I want to go ahead and I want to heat up some water by taking it to the rooftop and having it boil on that roof, no problem. You take the bottle of water, cold water, put it on the roof and let it boil. No problem, right? That's perfectly fine. Why? Because you're allowed to cook in the sunlight. No problem. That's
Could
not
make
called fire.
s'mores.
What?
You could make s'mores.
You could make s'mores. You could do whatever you want in the sunlight only. However, you may not, and this is cooking number 4, category number 4, this is called toledot hachama, the derivative of the sunlight. Okay? This, the rabbis prohibited. If let's say, instead of what we did before, instead of taking an egg, cracking it in the frying pan inside my house while the frying pan is still cold, I had a smart idea. I said, who does this? Who cooks like this? You know what? Let's make life a lot easier. Let me go upstairs. I'll put the pan on the frying pan. I'll put the frying pan on the rooftop. I'll let the frying pan get hot for about a half an hour. Then when I come and crack the egg on the frying pan, I'll hear that sizzle. It'll be ready in 2 minutes, right? Because the frying pan is already going to be at 200 degrees from the sunlight. It's getting heated up from the sun, right? So in that case, the halakha says you're not allowed to do that. The reason that you're not allowed to do that is not because it's actually considered cooking al pi halacha. The rabbis made a decree against it because of the fear that you may confuse cooking with the derivative of the sun with cooking with the derivative of the fire, which is really Bishul d'oraita. You might say, oh, well, this frying pan just came off the fire. And I remember that last week I cracked an egg on a frying pan that got heated up in the sun. So you see that that's not a problem. So I can crack an egg on a frying pan that just came off of the fire. And it's still very hot, which is an Isur d'oraita. So the rabbis prohibited toledot ha-chama, the derivative of the sun, with out of concern that you may confuse it for toledot ha'ur, and if you do, you may come to compare the two, and you'll say, oh well, if I cooked in the derivative of the sunlight, I can cook in the derivative of the fire, and that is a very grave sin. That's real cooking on Shabbat. So if, let's say, I left a sweater upstairs on the rooftop, the sweater was nice and black, it got boiling hot, and then I said, you know what, this is a great thing. I can take my raw eggs and put it up in the sweater and just kind of let it wrap inside of it. It's going to cook these eggs and they'll become hard-boiled eggs. Can't do that on Shabbat. Why? Because that's called toledet hachama, a derivative of the sun. And the derivative of the sun is prohibited on account of the derivative of the fire. Clear? So far, so good? No? Yeah?
We're not allowed to do any of it, like anything.
So you could heat up something in the sunlight. Like we said, you could take a bottle of water, put it on the rooftop, and let it boil.
Put eggs in a frying pan and put it in the rooftop.
You could not put eggs in a frying
I would
pan.
never do such a thing.
You could take eggs in a frying pan from your house and put it on the
From your house,
rooftop,
exactly.
right? But you cannot heat up the frying pan first on the rooftop and then crack an egg onto it. You understand?
Outside all at once.
So I'm saying you could take it, you could crack the eggs inside your house, take it outside.
Oh, I'm saying like, can you take the pan and the egg and just. Okay,
Yes,
like,
yes. The point is that,
needing to heat up.
yeah, the point is that you're not heating the pan up first. Right, exactly. You could technically put it inside or on top of a very hot car, right? Meaning in a frying pan, right?
Right.
The frying pan is cold, right? It's the pan that's heating it up. It's heating up in the sun, That's the point. But you can't, let's say, put the eggs on a car that's very, very hot and then let it boil like that.
But
in the
who would
car,
do
it's
such a
also-
thing?
It's important to get the concepts. Huh?
Wouldn't in the car be derivative of the sun also, because the sun first heated up
The car is definitely derivative of the sun, 100%.
inside.
If it's already hot, then yeah, that's right. Let's say you put it in at night, and
Oh, I see.
then in the morning it heats up already. It heats up with it, so then I'd be cooking in the sunlight. That would be, understand? So it's important to get I'll give you an example why this is important to know. One very good example of this, in Israel, a lot of the buildings have what they call a dud shemesh, which is a sun-heated water like cistern that they have on the top of their rooftops. And that's how they get their heat. And it's a lot of times just as hot as a boiler. You don't even need to turn on the boiler. Just the sunlight pounds on it and it gets really, really, really very hot. So technically speaking, that would be considered cooking in the chama, in the sunlight, right? Which is perfectly fine, right? There's nothing wrong with cooking in the sunlight. The problem becomes when you pull out hot water from there and cold water now goes into that tank. So now that cold water is getting heated up in the water that was heated up by the sunlight. So that's getting heated up in the derivative of the sunlight. That's forbidden. You understand? So there's different things that you need to be aware of, but it's important to remember that even still, the whole violation would be only midirabanan, and that makes a difference. Remember, it's just a prohibition out of a concern that you may come to confuse this type of cooking with the derivative of the fire, which is really cooking. The reason that it's important to remember this is because it will make a difference if there's a case, for example, where you don't have it in mind, etc., which we'll get to bli neder as we go along. So we have 4 types of cooking, right? We've got the ur, we have toledot ur, we have the chama, we have toledot chama. Clear? 100%? Okay, so now we move on back to toledot ur. So it's very important to get these ground rules down first. Let's talk about something that I'm sure you've heard before, but it's important to get clear. The concept called kli rishon, we just spoke about it a minute ago. Kli rishon is anything that was on the fire, any object, right, that was heated up by the fire. That vessel that was heated up by the fire, it was directly on the fire, it was directly heated from the fire, that object is considered to be a kli rishon, a first vessel. Like we said before, a kli rishon, the first vessel that was directly heated from the fire, can continue to cook long after it has been removed from the fire. Okay? It still has the powers of cooking. It's very important to remember. So if, let's say, for example, like we said, you want to take an egg and throw it into a hot pot of soup, you may not do that. If you have any kind of spices that you want to put into that hot pot of soup, and they're thin spices, you shouldn't do that. If they have never been cooked before, you would be cooking those spices, right? Because that pot of soup has the ability to cook long after it's off of the fire.
Like herbs?
It could be herbs that you haven't cooked before. It could be spices.
Like
that,
not salt and pepper.
So salt, no. Pepper, yes.
Black pepper.
Black pepper. Think about it. Has that black pepper ever been cooked before? No,
I
right?
thought about this. I don't know. I don't do this, but I just never thought
It's
about
okay. Now it's great. That's why we're here, to think about this stuff. So if I want to take black pepper and I want to put it into that pot of hot soup, so I'm cooking that black pepper because kli rishon, this is the pot that was on the fire, and it still has it's still yad soledet, it's still 113 degrees Fahrenheit, probably much more than that. And when I take something that has not been cooked and I put it into it, I am now cooking it halachically.
What about croutons?
That's a good question. We'll get to croutons a little bit later. So you had a question?
Yes, a hot water urn. Is that considered a kli rishon?
Absolutely. A hot water urn is a kli rishon, sure. It's attached. It has a heating element inside that is adding heat to it constantly. So therefore, it absolutely is a kli rishon, sure.
But when I make tea, I do like 4
We'll get
times.
to tea.
And then I
We'll get to tea. We'll get to tea. Right now, let's just talk basic stuff, right? Okay, so if I have anything that is not cooked and I am putting it into that kli rishon, so I have to be aware that I am now cooking on Shabbat. It's a problem. Okay, you got to make sure not to do that. So that's the power of kli rishon. And the reason for this is because due to the fact that the walls of the pot or the walls of the item that we're talking about have been directly heated up by the fire, the heat of that, the heat that has entered into the walls takes a long time to cool off. And they keep on adding, even while the contents of the pot are starting to go down in temperature, the heat from the walls of the pot continues to add heat into the contents, and it still has that ability to cook, even though it's no longer on the fire. Okay, that's step one. Chazal then take the next step, and they talk about something which is called the kli sheni. The kli sheni means a vessel that has been that has received contents from a kli rishon, but now those contents are in a new vessel. That vessel is called kli sheni, a second vessel. So let's talk about your example of the urn of hot water. If I take a cup and I pour water from the urn into the cup, the urn is kli rishon, the cup is kli sheni. Okay, very important. If you guys already know this stuff, forgive me. I need to talk about the fundamental ground rules of this melacha in order to continue. So kli sheni, that second vessel, is very important because Chazal make the statement kli sheni eino mivashel. Second vessel does not cook. Okay. Now the reason that the second vessel does not have the power to cook is because it lacks what the first vessel has. The first vessel has walls that are piping hot. The walls continue to add heat to the contents of the pot even long after it's removed from the fire. But a kli sheni doesn't have that because its walls were not heated up on the fire, and therefore the walls cool off what is inside of it. They don't add more heat. They actually take away heat because they don't have heat in them. They are cooling off whatever is being contained by them. So therefore, Chazal makes the statement, kli sheni eino mivashel. A secondary vessel does not cook. And this is incredibly important for us. The reason that this is very important for us is because what this means is that you could put something potentially into the second vessel, and it's not a problem. It won't be considered cooking. For example, let's say that you wanted to put some nana leaves in your tea, or forget about tea. Let's say nana leaves in some hot water, okay? Assuming you check them for bugs and you don't have a bug concern and whatever, okay? So you want to put it straight, you take water from the urn, put it in your cup, and now you want to put nana leaves in that cup. Are you allowed to, yes or no? Answer is yes. Why? Because the secondary vessel does not cook. Kli sheni eino mivashel, doesn't cook. So therefore, you would be, even though we're talking about very hot water, think about how hot that water is that comes out of the urn. It's really hot, right? But still, Chazal made a statement, kli sheni eino mivashel, secondary vessel does not cook. And that's what we run with. At least that's what the Sfaradim would go with. Okay? Yes.
You're saying you put banana in a third cup?
No third cup.
No, not the cup that you wanna.
No third cup. I took a cup. I put it underneath the hot water urn. Poured on,
Right.
okay? So just one cup.
So that's your kli sheni.
And I take nana leaves and put them straight in there.
Oh, straight in the kli
Kli
sheni.
sheni.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Okay. Why is that okay? Kli sheni eino mivashel. Second vessel does not cook.
So then, should I get, I'm not sure the question, so then why sometimes with tea?
Very good. We'll get there. We'll get there.
I always
Excellent. Excellent. We'll get there in a minute. 100%. Good question. Yes.
I always do more than I.
Okay, we'll get there. Hold on. We'll get there. We'll get there. We're good? So far, so good? Okay. Good. We'll get there. Good. Excellent. Okay. So now let's just stick with the concept of kli sheni for now. Okay. Let's just take it easy I want to understand. I want to give examples that illustrate the leniency of kli sheni. Let's say, for example, you would like to heat up a baby bottle. You have a baby needs to have a warm bottle, and you had some cold milk left over in the fridge, okay? You take out the bottle and you put it into that very kli sheni. Again, you went to the hot water urn. You poured water out of the hot water urn into maybe a big netilat yadayim cup, a big pitcher, maybe just a cup that's big enough to hold this bottle. And then you take the bottle and you put it inside of that cup, and you let the water, again, we said not to submerge it. Don't submerge it. Why? Because that's a hatmana question. We don't do that. Fine. But it's sitting there and it's not submerged, and it's getting the heat from the kli sheni, and this liquid is getting warmer and warmer and warmer. Why is that okay? Because kli sheni eino mivashet, the secondary cup, does not cook. Let's say that a person desires to make, you know what? You have a baby that got filthy. You can't turn on the hot water on Shabbat. Why can't you turn on the hot water on Shabbat? That's Bishul. Why is that Bishul? Because when you turn on the hot water, so then cold water goes into your boiler and gets heated. So you are doing what we talked about psik reisha. You're doing a psik reisha on Bishul on Shabbat, and you can't do that on Shabbat. Okay, so you can't turn on the hot water, no problem. But you have a hot water urn. So what you do instead is you take a huge pitcher or a big netilat yadayim cup maybe, fill up the hot water in that cup, and now it's a kli sheni, but it's boiling hot. It's very, very hot. And you can't pour this on the baby, God forbid, that would burn the baby. So what do? You pour some cold water into that hot water. Is that okay? 1,000,000% okay. Why? The fact is that cold water is getting hot. True. But kli sheni eino mivashet, secondary vessel, does not cook. So therefore, that would be perfectly fine. Clear? Okay.
I just want to understand.
Yeah.
something. When you were talking about putting pepper in a soup, so is it the actual soup pot?
Yes,
or
yes.
not
I was
like,
talking
let's say-
about.
Yeah, let's say you're having gandim.
We're gonna at that time I was talking about the actual soup pot, but we're gonna soon get to what about your bowl? Okay, we'll get there.
Wouldn't that be cliche?
We'll get there. Let's hold off on that. Right now, I just want to again focus on the leniencies of kli sheni. Okay, is it clear? So you have a kli sheni. Again, the key is kli sheni. Now, let's talk about, let's say, coffee. Okay, remember, well, we didn't talk about this yet, but it's important to mention. The rule is when it comes to any type of solid that has already been cooked, okay, the rule is en bishul achar bishul. There is never such a thing as cooking after something has already been cooked, and that refers to something which is a solid. Not talking about liquids, I'm talking about solids. So if let's say, for example, I have a piece of chicken, it's already been cooked, okay? And I want to heat it up, and I don't have a hot plate or whatever. I want to take it and put it into this, let's say, cup of boiling hot water. It's going to make it a little bit warmer. Can you do that? Sure, you could do that. Why? Because first of all, a kli sheni doesn't cook in the first place. And that cup of hot water is a kli sheni. You took water from the urn and put it into the cup. So that's a secondary vessel. It doesn't cook anyway. But this object has already been cooked. It's a piece of cooked chicken, right? You already cooked it in the soup, let's say. If you now want to put it into a hot secondary vessel, there's definitely no reason that would be a problem. Okay, now let's, instead of having chicken in that cup, which normally I don't think people would do, but let's say we're not talking about chicken. Let's say we're talking about coffee liquid that has been spray dried, and now it's a powder, and you put it into water and it becomes coffee. That's what we call instant coffee. It's right. It's coffee that was cooked, and the flavor of the beans came out into this liquid. They then spray dried it. They put it through this process with these huge towers with flames going through it that zap out all the moisture from it, and this powder comes down, right? And that's what we take and we put it into our coffee. We put it into our water, and it becomes instant coffee, right? So that has already been cooked. It's a solid that has already been cooked, okay? And since it's already been cooked, there's no problem to put it into a cup of hot water, right? Why? Because it already has been cooked. So are you cooking it now? No, it's already been cooked. Okay, very important. So if somebody asks you, can he take his cup, his spoon of instant coffee and put it into a kli sheni, the answer usually is going to be yes. And yeah. So from a technical standpoint, the answer is yes, right? Now, the problem is that usually speaking, we don't put things into a kli rishon because of a couple of different reasons. We don't want to look like we're cooking. But would it be called cooking? Not really. It's not cooking. The only problem that you run into, which I did see some of the Sfarim bring down, is that there are some types of coffee that have in them certain ingredients that were not cooked yet. For example, there's this coffee, I think it's from Elite or maybe Osem, I can't remember which one, and it's called Nescafe regular instant coffee. But then there's one that has an added vanilla flavoring. The vanilla flavoring that they add to it was never cooked before. And that gets cooked the first time around that you do it. So now we have to bear that in mind for the next halacha that we're going to talk about. Wow. Time flies.
What
Okay.
about those
What?
instant soups?
What?
Those instant soups.
Very good question. Let's get there. But so far, I just want to have everyone on the same page. Kli sheni eino mevashel. Clear? We know what those words mean? You have to know those words by heart. Kli sheni eino mevashel. Secondary vessel doesn't cook. Kli sheni eino mevashel. Secondary vessel does not cook. Okay. Now, the problem is like this, and this is the answer to all the questions that we were talking about before, that were brought up. There are certain things that, although we say a kli sheni does not cook, but there are certain things that are so easily cooked that they could even be cooked in the kli sheni. Okay? The term for that is called kalei habishul. Kalei habishul means things that are very easily cooked. The Gemara gives a very interesting example. The Gemara says there was a type of fish called the Spanish culias haispanim. It says that fish, they used to take it, they used to salt it, so it was heavily salted. Once they would throw some hot water on it, just pour some hot water on it, you would see the item got cooked. It got totally cooked. So this opens the door to a concept called kalei bishul, which means that there are certain items that the halacha deems very easily cooked. And if the halacha calls this item very easily cooked, then you may not put that into a kli sheni. Even though normally we say kli sheni eino mevashel, even though we normally say secondary vessel does not cook, but in this case it does. That's called kalei bishul. So one item. So now the general Sephardic approach is innocent until proven guilty, which means that the standard item that we're gonna, whatever we want to talk about, unless the rabbis pointed it out as something which we would call kalei bishul, something that's very easily cooked, we will not consider it to be kalei bishul. Okay, this is contrary to what the Mishnah Berurah writes, which the Ashkenazi approach is guilty until proven innocent, which means that they're going to consider everything to be potentially kalei bishul, and therefore you can't really put anything into a kli sheni because maybe it's kalei bishul. But let's talk about the stuff that everybody agrees about. So you mentioned before tea. Tea leaves, the Mishnah Berurah and most authorities write that tea leaves are what we would call kalei habishul, which means that you may not put tea leaves into a second vessel. That's pretty much the consensus of everybody, because tea leaves, even in a kli sheni, do get cooked. They're so small, their surface area is very, very limited, just little tea leaves. And really, it's a theme that we'll see in a lot of different areas. When you have something that's very, very, very small, very like powdery, like any kind of spice, like
Hot
the really,
chocolate?
like not black pepper pieces, but like black pepper that's really finely ground, or any of these spices that are very, very, they're so small that they're like powder, we would consider them to be kalei bishul, perhaps,
Like cinnamon,
like ground cinnamon.
right?
Yeah, correct. Any of these spices, we would call them kalei bishul, because they're not like what they used to be. Back in the day, they would still be somewhat bigger, thicker pieces that you kind of chopped up at some point, and they're heavier. But now that they're so like a powder, so many poskim are concerned that they're considered to be kalei bishul, which are the very easily cooked items like that Spanish fish. So let's stick with tea for now. Tea, being that the poskim identified it as kalei bishul, we are not supposed to take a tea bag and put it into the cup of hot water, right? Because of the fact that that cup, we're assuming, will have the cooking effect on the tea bag. And therefore, we are not allowed to take that tea bag and put it in there. So now, that's off limits. Let's say the same thing for that powder, those types of powder spices. So for example, a bowl of soup, and you want to put pepper, you want to put garlic, you want to put any of these types of powdery spices into the bowl of soup. If the bowl of soup is a kli sheni, then you cannot do it. Now we're going to see that potentially a bowl of soup might be already what we would call a kli shlishi, at which point it would be okay. But if it's a kli sheni, it's a problem. Okay. Now, yeah, all these things.
So like, let's say you're serving cholent to your guests.
So let's talk about some very important details here. Okay. Well, first of all, before we get there, now we have to introduce a third concept, and this is called kli shlishi. Kli shlishi means the third vessel, which means that if you removed the contents from the first vessel and put them into the second vessel, and then you took those contents and put them into a third vessel, at this point, according to most poskim, the third vessel does not have the power to cook, even things that are kalei bishul, even things that are very easily cooked. Okay, so therefore, at this point, we can talk about the solution potentially for tea. There are going to be two main solutions. The first solution is to go ahead and create what's called tea essence before Shabbat. This seems to be the solution that satisfies all opinions. The reason that this satisfies all opinions is because what you're doing is you're taking the tea leaves, you are cooking them ahead of time before Shabbat, you create this very thick concentrate of tea essence, and now it's just pouring in a liquid into water. It could be warm liquid, it could be a cold liquid. The point is that pouring in, as we learned, pouring in a cold liquid into a hot kli sheni is no problem whatsoever, right? Because the kli sheni doesn't cook. So therefore, you're not pouring in tea leaves, you're pouring in tea essence, which is just a liquid. It's no different than if you were to pour in cold water into that very hot cup that you just poured out from the urn, right? So therefore, tea essence is a really nice, clear, simple solution to resolving the problem of having tea on Shabbat. Now, if let's say you did not make tea essence, do you have a solution if you want to use a tea bag? The answer is sure. The answer is you could take that cup of hot water and pour it into another cup of hot water. And now the next cup of hot water is already a kli shlishi, because the urn was the kli rishon. You then poured from the urn into the first cup. That first cup is the kli sheni, the second vessel. You then poured from that first cup into a second cup, and that second cup is called a kli shlishi, a third vessel, because the urn is the first, the cup is the second cup is the third. And therefore, once you have the water that's boiling hot in the kli shlishi, the third vessel, you may now take a tea bag and put it into that third vessel. The reason being that at this point it's a kli shlishi, and most poskim are of the opinion that it will not be considered halachically cooking when it's in a third vessel. And therefore, you could put it in there. How do you take it out? Well, number one, we don't squeeze the tea bag, number one. Number two, we had learned there's a question of borer if you take it out. As is, Chacham Ovadia held it's not a problem. He held you could just take it and throw it out. Others said at least try and take it with a spoon so that you take some of the liquid with the bag. Okay, we spoke about that in the laws of borer. But the point is that as far as cooking is concerned, it's not a problem of cooking because you're putting it into a kli shlishi. Clear? Everyone good?
So can you warm up the tea essence and then add it into the hot water with the cliche, or does that have to just be?
So warming, so liquid is different than solid. By liquid, we hold that when a liquid cools down, to then reheat the liquid is a problem,
Oh, yeah, we can.
right? You can't reheat a liquid on Shabbat, right? So therefore, you can't, but you don't really need to, honestly, because if you have a boiling hot cup of water, you just pour the liquid in, it's going to be very hot. You don't need to really reheat it.
But so if someone has tea essence, they put it on the blech, whatever, they can't take it off and
Okay,
give
we're
it to
gonna,
people and
so
then transfer it back.
no, so that those rules about when you want to take something off and put it back on, Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to get to that a different time. That's going to be a complicated discussion, but the answer is going to be that under certain circumstances, you could, well, under certain circumstances, you could. I had a question I needed to answer.
Yeah,
What was it?
so if you have the hot soup, can you put something half cooked in it?
Okay,
Or like a third?
I have a hot soup. Can I put something that's a third cook? Now, so there's no question I can't put it into a kli rishon, okay? Because that would be actually cooking it, right? Now, what if it's in a kli sheni? Is that an act of cooking? So it's not really an act of cooking anymore because a kli sheni doesn't cook unless it's the kind of item that is what we would call kalei bishul, very easily cooked, okay? Which I don't think most items fall into that category, so that would probably be okay. But it would be kind of weird if it's not really cooked. And, you know what I'm saying? I don't know how it would work out. Okay, but I do want to mention one more point before we go on. The ladle plays a big factor. A ladle plays a big factor in determining whether something is a kli whether, let's say, a bowl of soup is a kli shlishi or a kli sheni. What happens is when you take soup with a ladle from the big pot, so technically speaking, that ladle is a second vessel. Why? Because that ladle is a container. It's a container that holds soup. So you put your ladle into the pot of soup. Technically, this ladle is vessel number 2. When you then pour into the bowl, now the bowl is vessel number 3. Okay, that's a big leniency. Very important to be aware of that, because now the difference is, this is the difference between you being allowed to put pepper in your soup or you're not being allowed to put pepper in your bowl of soup. If you had a ladle with which you scooped out the soup and then dished it to the bowl, so then you would say, oh, that's a third vessel. The bowl is a kli shlishi, because the pot of soup is vessel number 1, the ladle that scooped it out is vessel number 2, and the bowl is number 3. Now, this leniency has one caveat, which is that this is all provided that the ladle was not sitting in the pot of hot soup for an extended period of time. Because if the ladle sat in the hot pot of soup for an extended period of time, it now gets the status of the kli rishon itself. And what is an extended period of time? I don't have a number for you, but it means that it was there long enough that it really absorbed the heat. It was really there for a nice amount of time, and in other words, it wasn't just I scooped, I took out, I scooped, I took out. It was sitting there. It was sitting there for a nice amount of time. Once that's the case, so now the ladle gets the status of kli rishon, and your bowl, if you then, after it has the status of kli rishon, you then dish it out into the bowl, your bowl is actually kli sheni, vessel number 2. And therefore you would not be allowed to put your pepper and stuff inside of it, because it's kalei bishul. It's things that get very easily cooked in a kli sheni, which is a problem.
What if you wait long enough? I was gonna say, what if you wait long enough that it's not like so hot?
What if in other words, it cooled down?
Right, like it's still hot, but it's, you wait a few minutes.
Yeah, no, if you wait, no, well, you see, a few minutes isn't really enough. Usually the pot of soup that was on the fire.
Not the pot, like the bowl, like before.
Oh, you're saying the bowl isn't so hot? The bowl of soup isn't so hot anymore?
Right, like you wanna put pepper in or salt and pepper.
Yeah. If the bowl of soup isn't so hot anymore, it's below 113, then you're good.
The bowl or the content?
The contents. Yeah,
So the bowl is not hot, it's not,
correct. The contents would need to be below 113.
and head in your chest.
Yeah.
Is it so hot that?
You'd need to, so there's an interesting thing that Ben Ish Chai says, which I don't know if everyone holds of this, but Ben Ish Chai says if you can put it in your mouth without having to blow on it, then it's not Yad Soledet anymore.
Someone also said, the Rebbetzin also said, if you could, like, let's say hot water, if you could keep your hand under it for 14 seconds without taking it out. I don't know. Just like,
Possibly,
I don't know
if
if
it's
heard that.
possible, I don't know, I'm not familiar, but
I'm
it's very
thinking about it.
possible. Yeah, very good. Yeah, very nice, very good. Okay. Good. Just one more point that I want to try and get in. If let's say you have hot water and you wanna pour some cold water into it. So like we said, kli sheni doesn't cook, right? What if it was the opposite? What if it's cold water in the cup and you want to pour hot water from the urn onto the cold water? So the answer is that as long as you're not pouring so much hot water that it's going to completely overpower the cold water and turn it into just have like a little inch or two of cold water and you're filling up the cup with massive amounts of hot water. No, that would be no good. What I'm talking about is you have, let's say, a nice amount of cold water on the bottom, and you have some hot water being poured onto the cold water, no problem. Why? Because the rule is tata'a gavar, which means the bottom always wins. And therefore, the bottom is cold, and we consider the cold to not be getting cooked by the water that's getting poured onto it from the top. Hope that was clear. Again, one more time. So if I have cold water in a cup, and I don't want it to be so cold, I want to heat it up a little bit. Can I pour hot water from the urn onto it? The answer is yes. It's not considered cooking the cold water on the bottom because the cold water overpowers the water that's coming onto it from the top. But that's provided that it's not a tremendous amount of hot water being poured onto the cold water and therefore totally overpowering the cold water. Okay, I guess we'll stop over here for today. Tiskula mitzvot, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we'll call it a night.